Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in just a moment while people join the webinar. Feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the chat box. If any questions come to mind, you can submit those in the Q&A. While more people join the webinar, just a couple reminders. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access the on-demand webinar after this live webinar ends, and you can access that with the same link that you registered with. We'll be sharing a number of resources during the webinar. There'll also be links to a number of these resources in the slide deck as well. Great, so we can get started. So this webinar is presented in partnership with the Pioneer Institute. So we're very grateful to their help and a number of panelists here today. This is A Vision of Hope, Catholic Schooling in Massachusetts. Feel free to submit questions in the Q&A or leave your comments in the chat box. And we encourage you to share the recording of this webinar with your friends and colleagues if you find it helpful. So with that, I will pass it off to Kathy Mears for an opening prayer and kick us off. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, John, and thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation. First of all, we will begin with prayer as we do all things in Catholic education. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, as we gather together, we ask for your blessings on us, the children we serve, and their families. We ask that you guide us and bless us, always seeking to do your will. We pray that our children will enjoy a safe summer, our teachers and principals will find rest, and that we will begin each day of our school year with you in mind, knowing that is from you all good things come. We pray all this in the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate that you are here. I'm Kathy Mears. I'm the interim president and CEO of the National Catholic Educational Association. Previous to this position, I worked in the Archdiocese of Boston as the superintendent of Catholic schools. I'm joined today by other wonderful people who will introduce themselves, but we are all grateful to be here and to share the story of Catholic education in Boston and how we do bring hope to many who are enrolled in our schools, and probably for many who would wish to be enrolled in our schools. So I'm going to start with a story. And the story is one of a 10-year-old boy who was asked to read the 10 Commandments, to state them, to stand up in front of his class and say, these are the 10 Commandments. But the little boy did not do that because he was a Catholic. And the commandments that he was asked to speak about and to recite were Protestant. They were from the King James Bible. And he knew that he couldn't do that because he was a Catholic. So Thomas Wall endured a beating that day in 1859 at the Eliot School in Boston. It was a thrashing that left him bloodied and bruised, and he fainted. And over the next few days, Catholic students attending public schools in Boston walked out of their classrooms in protest of the treatment of Thomas. And they also went to rally against the teaching of the Protestant faith in public schools. Over the next few years, Catholics built hundreds of schools across Boston and the United States to ensure that their children received a quality education that included the teaching of the Catholic faith and not the Protestant faith. And I think it's a story that we have lost sight of, but we need to understand that's really started the explosion of schools, Catholic schools in the country. The Catholic immigrants who built those schools and faced ingrained anti-Catholic prejudice among many in the Protestant majority. The Eliot School teachers were following Massachusetts law when they asked the young Thomas Wall to recite the 10 Commandments. Public schools were steeped in the values and traditions of the majority, and they were intended to be instruments by which immigrants would be assimilated into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant norm. The common schools taught young Catholics Protestant translations of the Bible. They also questioned the validity of Catholic Christianity, and they placed little value on the native languages and customs of the newcomers. They generally created structures that impeded upward mobility for those immigrant children. And that's really important because Catholic schools don't do that. They actually do the opposite. Catholic schools not only provide continuity, shelter, and support to immigrants, but they also provide them with the skills to be successful in America. Our immigrant ancestors often came to the New World with only the clothes on their backs. Despite their lack of financial resources, the children were taught and they learned. Since their inception, Catholic schools have lifted more people out of poverty than any other private institution in the world. And I think that's really important for us to note. So Catholic schools grew in the Archdiocese of Boston and across the country. They taught their children that they could serve their God by serving others. They taught their children of the saving grace of Jesus, and they also taught their children reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they did it well. You only have to look at today's Supreme Court, the Supreme Court that issued the decision of Espinoza, and you can see that Catholic schools have made a difference, as 6 of the judges attended Catholic schools. So Catholic schools have been successful in Boston and across the world, and in today's meeting, we hope to share with you more about Catholic education and about private schools and how we can reach out and hopefully make sure that more people can have access to quality education based on what a parent feels is best for their child. The Catholic Church is the only church that has actual documents that say that as Catholic schools, we are to partner with our parents. We say that parents are the first and primary teachers of their children, and it is up to us to support those parents in their desire to have the education that they want for their children. Catholic schools embrace that relationship, and most recently during COVID, we know how important that relationship was in order for our students to do well. Our teachers came prepared to teach during COVID. They did it well. Many people saw that. Our schools are finishing years where they had 180 in-person days. And thankfully, thank you, that our students were safe and they did not become ill. Our teachers were safe and they did not become ill. But it was through that dedication, that relationship between parents and teachers, that this could happen in a way that was safe, in a way that allowed our children to have the best possible education. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kendra, and we'll let Kendra tell her story, because her story is the story of a parent who wanted the best for her children.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to all of you at NCEA. It's an honor to be invited here today. In 2015, I met with Erica Smith and Dick Comer, attorneys from the Institute for Justice, in a coffee shop here in Kalispell, Montana. It was there that I agreed to be the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Montana Department of Revenue regarding the use of scholarship funds from a tax credit program used to help children such as mine attending religious schools. We fought hard for nearly 5 years, going through district court, the Montana Supreme Court, where they ruled in favor of the Department of Revenue, and finally the US Supreme Court, where the justices reversed Montana's highest court and ruled that religious schools cannot be excluded as options for parents who choose to use funds from scholarship programs for private education for their children. It's been an incredible experience and a long journey through which we have gained much knowledge. We've been forced to muster up courage and developed a greater passion for speaking up when freedoms are violated. But the hard work must continue. Now that the Blaine amendments have been found unconstitutional, a new window of opportunity has been opened to allow states to enact school choice legislation that will benefit our students for years to come. Well, how has Montana turned this opportunity into reality? Well, my girls and I have continued to be a part of this battle for school choice, testifying at recent House and Senate hearings here in Montana. And on May 12th of this year, we had the honor of being present at the governor's signing for new legislation that greatly expanded Montana's school choice program, which will bring much needed funds into the scholarship program and make allowances for future growth as the program reaches capacity. This is such a huge win for Montana students. And now for other students to ensure options for their students, or other states to ensure options for their students for coming generations, they must also follow suit and develop scholarship programs that will help raise the bar on education and potentially alter the future for millions of children. Education tax credit programs offer incentives to attract donations from private citizens to scholarship organizations, which then distribute the funds to families such as mine to help with the cost of tuition at private schools, whether religious or not. Often, but not always, those schools are religious. When the Montana legislature passed their tax credit program in 2015, I was and still am a single mom, and I was looking for a better education for my girls, one that challenged them to a greater extent academically, one that taught them the value and importance of critical thinking, and one that more closely aligned with the Christian values that I endeavor to teach at home. In the public school, my older daughter was ridiculed and my younger daughter really struggled academically, but both of them would later thrive at Stillwater Christian School, where they have been now for 6 years. When Montana Supreme Court struck down our tax credit program, I was denied access to the scholarships that my daughters needed. And while I understood the implications of this for my family, I also recognized how it would impact thousands of other families across Montana and ultimately across the United States. I was willing to work hard to give my daughters the best that I could, but my limited income would only take us so far. In order for my girls to go to private school, we needed assistance, which would come in the way of scholarship programs. And I can tell you with certainty that there are millions of other families out there, such as mine, who desperately desire better options for their children, but without the aid of scholarships and financial assistance programs, they will not be able to make those dreams a reality. And I can attest to the fact that more than 90% of parents with students in tax credit school choice programs say they are very satisfied with these programs. As you know, less than 100 years after the founding of our great nation, Blaine amendments were legislated as a way to block funds from being directed to the Catholic schools where many of the Irish immigrants sent their children. And since then, in recent years, numerous states have been using these Blaine amendments as a means to restrict school choice options, effectively discriminating against families, religious families in particular, and preventing parents from accessing better educational options for their children. When our nation was founded, there wasn't to be a state religion, but neither was there to be a ban on state or local government support for citizens who chose to exercise their religious beliefs. Religious freedom and religious tolerance are one of the cornerstones that this great nation was founded upon, and the majority of the early state constitutions undoubtedly intended for there to be public support for a wide range of religious, private, and secular school options. In fact, the majority of public schools in the early years of this country were predominantly religious in nature, with prayer and Bible teaching being a regular part of the daily education, because it was understood that Christian-based values and faith were foundational to the proper upbringing of future generations. In 2018, the Montana Supreme Court, which ruled against us, based its ruling on our state's Blaine Amendment, which barred public support to religious institutions. As of the date of the US Supreme Court ruling on our case last year, 37 other states also had Blaine amendments on their constitutions. But our attorneys successfully argued at our nation's highest court that tax credit scholarship programs are entirely constitutional and do not amount to the use of public funds for religious institutions, as the money is granted to the parents who then choose the school that is best for their child, whether that school is religious or not. US Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the majority opinion for our case that, quote, "A state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious." Now, the court's ruling doesn't end this battle. It simply begins a new stage in the fight for the right of all of us parents to choose the education that is most appropriate for our children. State leaders around the country should be taking advantage of this historic decision by enacting or expanding legislation that makes religious liberty and school choice a reality for millions more families. What's so interesting to me is that in America's choice-driven higher education system, which is world-renowned, both the federal government and the individual states support students by way of scholarships and loans, whether they go to a private college, whether religious or not, or a public college or university. But to this point, they have not offered that same degree of support for primary and high school level education, where it's imperative that a strong academic and moral foundation is laid from an early age. I believe it's time that such programs are enacted at these lower levels, and our recent Supreme Court win presents the perfect opportunity to make that happen. As parents are becoming more aware of what their children are learning and are pushing back against a failing public education system, we're seeing enrollments at public schools declining considerably, with families choosing private school options instead. I believe that, as our founding fathers understood, there can be no morality without faith. And what better way to raise up a virtuous generation than with faith-based, values-based education at the primary and high school levels, something that unfortunately is no longer found at the public schools. As George Washington stated at the end of his second term in 1796, he said, quote, "Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." It is imperative that we stand up and fight for quality education, else we lose what those who have gone before us fought so hard for, to make this nation the most blessed and most powerful nation in history. And as Benjamin Franklin informed us on that summer day in Philadelphia in 1787, we have, quote, "a republic if you can keep it." We must never give up fighting for future generations. Thank you for allowing me to share with you today. I would now like to turn it over to, I believe, Jason Bedrick with EdChoice to share his remarks.
Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you having me. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that now. So I'm going to be talking about the tax credit scholarships that Kendra Espinoza was just talking about. But first, I want to look at this is data from the Cato Institute that they published earlier this year about school closures last year due to COVID and other reasons, but mostly due to COVID. And you can see that 111 Catholic schools around the country closed down last year as a result of COVID. They're 84% of the schools. So of all the school closures, it was really the Catholic schools that bore the real brunt of this. That amounts to close to about 30,000 students that were attending these schools. And the Cato Institute further calculated that if this were to continue, and let's say they were to reach 100,000 students, that would be an additional $1.5 billion in costs to the public school system nationwide. But really, I think we should be looking also at the students. What's the cost to students and society? It's absolutely incalculable not having access to an immersive Catholic education, especially when there is so much research that shows the positive effects of students, not just their academic performance of attending a private school, particularly a religious school, but also the increased likelihood that they're going to graduate, that they're going to go on to college, that they're less likely to have an out-of-wedlock birth, less likely to be engaged in crime, more likely to have higher levels of civic knowledge and engagement, particularly showing political tolerance, something that our society is in desperate need of right now. So it really, truly is incalculable, the loss when any school, but particularly a religious school or a Catholic school, closes down. Fortunately, there is hope. Earlier this year, my colleague at EdChoice, Mike McShane, and I were talking about how this could be the year of educational choice, and absolutely it has been so far. 14 states have enacted so far 5 new educational choice programs and have expanded 14 existing ones. And there are at least 6 states that are still considering legislation right now. You can see there has been tremendous growth, especially over the last 10 to 20 years in terms of the number of programs nationwide. This is already a little bit out of date because there have been several programs that passed this year. I think we have about 71 programs in about 34, 35 states right now, serving 1.3 million students across the country. And in the next year or two, that's the number of students that are going to be participating is going to increase tremendously. Right now, there are 19 states that have tax credit scholarship programs. This is the most popular type of school choice program. Whereas the traditional voucher uses public funds and you get a portion of what the government would have spent on your child at the public school, it follows the child to a private school. In this case, with the tax credit scholarship program, individual or corporate donors will make a contribution to a scholarship organization. They will get a tax credit anywhere from 50% to dollar for dollar, depending on the state that you're in. And then those organizations give scholarships to eligible students. This year already, Arkansas became the 20th state to enact a tax credit scholarship program. You see, again, tremendous growth, especially over the last decade and a half in terms of the number of scholarships awarded nationwide. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you can see there is just tremendous support. So again, Arkansas adopting a new program for low and middle income families, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, all increasing the number of families that are eligible, increasing the eligibility. In Iowa, raising their credit value also from 65 to 75%. Kansas had previously what's called a failing school model, where only the students at the 100 lowest ranked schools in the state could be eligible. They recognize there are problems with that model because, even if you're assigned to a very good school, that doesn't mean you're the right fit for that school. So they change it to low income students. Montana, the home of Kendra Espinoza, already had a program that was technically open to everybody, but the donors could only get a tax credit for up to $150. So you needed a dozen or two donors just to get a sizable scholarship. It was very, very hard. So there were actually the program that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court actually only had a handful of families that were participating in it at the time. The Montana legislature this year increased the per donor cap from $150 to $200,000. They also increased the escalator. That means that it can the amount of tax credits available is going to continue to grow. It increases the scholarship size as well, so that the scholarship organizations can give really meaningful scholarships. So in the next year, we're hoping that this program is really going to take off and serve a lot more families. Likewise, Oklahoma, massive increase from $3.5 million to $25 million. South Dakota eliminated the prior public requirement. This is also very important because a lot of states say, well, first you got to go to a public school, and if it doesn't work out, then you can apply for a scholarship. But there are a lot of families who from the outset know that they want a Catholic education or a Jewish education or something else for their child. Why should they have to send their child to a public school first when they know that the education that's the right fit for them is actually somewhere else? Additionally, there are a bunch of states now that have what are called education savings accounts. Now, these are publicly funded. I'll put a footnote on that, but publicly funded. Unlike a traditional voucher, though, you think of the voucher as a coupon. You're using the entire voucher in one place at one time for private school tuition. With the ESA, you can use the funds for a wide variety of educational expenses. So tuition, but also things like tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, lots of special needs therapy, and any funds that are left over can be rolled over from year to year and even used for college. You can see Indiana also added one. We had 5 programs walking into 2021, that is. Kentucky and West Virginia adopted new programs this year. Indiana also adopted a program. We haven't updated this yet. And Missouri also just adopted a tax credit funded ESA. There's an asterisk there because the governor has not yet signed it, but hopefully he will. But both Missouri and Kentucky are the first 2 states to adopt tax credit funded ESA. So this is sort of a combination of the ESA program and the tax credit scholarship program. Think of it, operating sort of like the tax credit scholarships already do, except that you can use it for that wide variety of expenses that I just described with the ESA. So within the next year, hopefully we're going to see these 2 programs get off the ground. And like I said, these are for low and middle income families. Tax credit scholarships used to be the most popular form of school choice every year in our Schooling in America survey, although in recent years, the education savings accounts have come out ahead, but you can still see there was growth in the support for school choice, from 2017 on. But really, over the course of 2020, with COVID and all the school shutdowns, we're seeing the highest levels of support for all types of school choice that we've ever seen. But especially, 3/4 of families saying they support tax credit scholarships, and more than 80% saying that they support ESAs. And that's, when you look just at, African Americans or Hispanics or parents of school-age children, those levels of support actually are even higher. Now, not all tax credit scholarship programs are designed equal. I put out a report recently with the Pioneer Institute called Earning Full Credit that goes into how to design a tax credit scholarship program. So just quickly to talk about some of the key features in terms of eligibility, there are a number of programs that limit eligibility only to very narrow categories of students with special needs or students that are from very low income families. We think it should be for all children. The promise of public education is that every single child should have access to a quality education. Of course, if there are funding limits, it makes sense to prioritize those who are the most in need. But ultimately, the goal should be that every child has access. And again, as we discussed earlier, we should avoid those prior public requirements. The tax credit value should be as close to 100% of the taxpayer's contribution as possible. When it is lower, that means there are more savings to the state, but the ultimate purpose of the program is empowering families. And so that should be the key priority. In terms of tax credit caps, you want to make sure the program is large enough that it is sufficient to provide scholarships for all families who want one. You should include escalator clauses that allow the cap automatically to grow over time so that it keeps up with rising demand. The per donor caps should also be pegged to inflation at the very least, because if they are not, then you're going to dilute that value over time. And in terms of academic accountability, you don't want to mandate one single standardized test like the state test for everybody. A lot of people in the research community, we need apples to apples comparisons. Yeah, the tests are important. They provide information to families, but you don't want schools altering their curriculum based on the test so that their students perform better on the test. Better that they design the curriculum they think is best, that meets their students' needs, and then choose the standardized tests from a menu of nationally normed reference tests that best matches their curriculum. So with that, I thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to the next speaker.
I think that would be me, so I will go right ahead. I'm Kara Kandel, and I am a senior fellow at Pioneer Institute, as well as the managing director of policy at ExcelinEd, also known as the Foundation for Excellence in Education. And I'm here today to talk a little bit more specifically about Massachusetts. As one of the co-editors of the book, A Vision of Hope, Catholic Schooling in Massachusetts. I'd like to, before I begin though, thank Kendra for every time she tells her story, I am reminded of why it is that we do this work. We do this work for families, we do this work for kids. And sitting here in Massachusetts and listening to Jason talk about this being the year of choice and all of the various choice options that families now have to access the school that is the best fit for their kids. I have to say we are one of only 2 states that whose Blaine Amendment will likely hold under the recent Supreme Court decision. And I think that our Catholic schools give Massachusetts plenty to work for when it comes to providing families with more options via something like a tax credit scholarship. And I'll tell you a little bit about why. In our book, which I co-edited with Chris Sinicola, and which some of the wonderful people here contributed chapters to, we highlight actually a period in time. That was that period when actually Kathy Mears was the superintendent of the Archdiocese of Boston. So this book represents work chapters that have been compiled that were written over a long period of time, but really highlights what it is that Catholic schools in Massachusetts, and yes, there are many in Boston, do for kids, who they welcome, what they represent. And part of the headline here is that Catholic schools in Massachusetts and Catholic schools in Boston are much like Catholic schools in other places. They have some pretty distinctively Catholic features, which we think is a wonderful thing. And the first thing I will say that sort of defines Catholic schools in Massachusetts is that they truly welcome all comers. So you can enter a Catholic school in any place in the state, and certainly in the city of Boston, where I've studied Catholic schools extensively, and realize that that many of the children who attend that school, in fact, might not identify as Catholic, but their family has chosen the school in part because it provides a Catholic education. So it sounds contradictory. What does that mean? It means that families are looking for some of what I would call the hallmarks of Catholic education, strong academic outcomes certainly being one, but also, and perhaps more importantly to families, an education that's rooted in values, that's rooted in, even if it's rooted in a Catholic faith and the family's not Catholic, families often say, I really want a character-laden, values-driven form of education. And that's what Catholic schools in this country and in Massachusetts provide. I mentioned academic outcomes, and in our book, we present data that are at this point a few years old, but nonetheless hold true. And the academic outcomes that Catholic schools, we specifically looked at the Archdiocese of Boston, achieve. They're very strong. As Jason mentioned, we don't want schools, private schools, faith-based schools to have to take a state test, but norm-referenced examinations, ACT results, other norm-referenced SAT results, other norm-referenced examinations can be very important in helping us understand whether or not students are learning. And we know that students in Massachusetts Catholic schools are absolutely learning. Their scores on norm reference tests are not only better than the sending district, what we would call it, that of Boston, but they're also better than the state, and they are competitive nationally. So we know that students in Catholic schools in Massachusetts, and I should be very clear in saying students of all background. So not students that are coming to these schools with high amounts of social capital because their parents can pay tuition. Oftentimes Catholic schools are working very, very hard and going into great amounts of debt, which has led to school closures, in order to welcome anybody who wants Catholic education, which means many families are not paying the full cost, and the full cost of Catholic education remains low and often does not represent the full cost of what it is to actually educate a student in a Catholic school. So Catholic schools are doing these things in Boston and across the country: academic excellence, values-laden education. They're giving families something that they want. And in many cases, they are the only alternative, especially in a place like Massachusetts, where we have a cap on the number of charter schools that can exist. And we have no private school choice programs, no tuition tax credit scholarships, no vouchers, no education savings accounts, in part because of our very strong Blaine Amendment, in part because of the political climate here. But what that means is that oftentimes, if families are not satisfied with their local public school, with their district school, the one to which they are often residentially assigned, Catholic schools are often the only option that families have that is not that school. And lucky for many families, they turn out to be a very good option, a very strong option. I'd like to spend just a moment talking about, and Kathy touched upon this a little bit in her opening remarks, the importance of distinctiveness in Catholic education and maintaining that kind of distinctiveness. So as I said, families choose Catholic schools for a reason. They all have their own reason, but it might be academic excellence, it might be the kind of education that's being delivered. Whatever the reason is, families have it. And what we've seen in some places as Catholic schools have suffered, the pandemic was particularly hard on Catholic schools, but the lower enrollments and Catholic school closures started well before that, and for a number of reasons, many of them financial, which I already went into. It's hard to offer all families an education at no cost when it costs money to actually operate a school. And so too many Catholic schools have suffered in doing that. What we've seen over time, unfortunately, is some Catholic schools saying, in order to boost enrollment, what can I do? And one of the things, and I'd like to thank former Superintendent Mears for this, that I think she was very good on, is saying to Catholic schools, what we can do is be Catholic. what we can do is distinguish ourselves by being who we are, not by trying to be the district school that families are in fact saying, that's not for me right now, I'd like this other form of education. So I encourage us all to think about whether we are simply advocates of Catholic education, whether we have been educated in a Catholic school ourselves, to think about what it means for Catholic schools to maintain their distinctive character, which doesn't, by the way, mean that Catholic schools can't also think about how they might play around the edges, offer new options, and innovate in certain ways. And this is one other thing that I'd like to touch upon that the book really does go into. We highlight different models of Catholic education, many of which are emerging. So the one model that distinguished Catholic schools during the pandemic, I have to say, is they were open. They were open, they were safe, families felt safe, kids felt safe, and I have heard the current superintendent of Catholic schools of the Archdiocese of Boston say, you know, the traditional model, air quotes, of Catholic education worked really well for us during the pandemic because it was great to put kids in rows, kind of far apart from each other, not necessarily seated at tables and touching each other all the time. That doesn't mean that that's what all Catholic schools look like. In fact, we see diverse models of Catholic schools in Massachusetts and across this country. We see work-study models, as we do in our 2 Cristo Rey schools here in Massachusetts. Across the country, we see Catholic schools that take a Montessori approach. So there's a lot of innovation going on in Catholic schools, and they can still remain distinctively Catholic. We can offer distinctive approaches, pedagogical approaches, and still be distinctively Catholic in our model of delivery. So I don't want to go on too much longer, but I do want to say that, as I mentioned at the outset, here in Massachusetts, there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope for giving families more opportunity, especially using public funds or even privately raised funds to access a Catholic education. And that's something that I hope we can all rally around and think about, especially in this moment, because 2 things are incredibly clear. Yes, Catholic schools enrollments are declining and many are closing due to financial strain, but they are certainly something worth saving. They are certainly something that parents want. And one way to do that is to help all parents have access to the schools that they want for their children by providing them with something such as a tuition tax credit scholarship, or maybe someday, as I would like to see as a resident of Newton, Massachusetts, an education savings account, something that will really provide parents with ultimate flexibility, because not only will Catholic schools benefit, but much more importantly, families and kids will benefit the most. And I think I'll hand it over now to Emmett.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you to everyone. And what a great, fantastic panel. So my name is Emmett McGroarty. I'm the research director at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. And I'm going to lead the Q&A right now. So if you have questions, just type them in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Let's start with a first question, a question for Kendra. Kendra, you fought all the way to the Supreme Court to ensure that your daughters had a particular type of education. Could you tell us about the academic quality and school culture in your daughter's school that motivated this fight?
Certainly, thank you so much for that question. It's been really important to me to give my daughters a solid foundation for which to base their future. And for me, that means just not only giving them the highest level of academics available, but giving them the opportunity to be taught Christian values at a school that mirrors what I am trying to teach at home. I know how vulnerable children can be and how easily they are influenced at a young age. If we as parents don't give them a solid foundation and a solid understanding of the Bible and a biblical worldview, they won't have that relationship with Christ, and they'll falter as they go through life. They won't have that hope. They won't have that sense of peace and sense of direction. And so I just really felt that it was important for me to go ahead and take this role when I was asked to take it, because I was not only serving my family, but I was also serving my community around me and other families and parents in our community and across Montana. But I actually didn't think of it going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court when I initially took on the case. Didn't quite imagine it going that far.
Thank you. Next question is for Jason. Jason, you attended Catholic schools and have authored lots of research on private and religious school choice programs. Could you talk to us about why religiously based schools are so central to the wider school choice movement?
Sure. Yeah. So I did attend a Catholic high school. I was actually the first non-Catholic to receive the Religious Studies Award upon graduation, and now send my children to a Jewish school where my wife is a teacher. Religious school. There's a reason that most private schools are actually religious schools, and that I think is because it's the main thing that parents are looking for that they cannot find in any public school. The public school system used to be a religious school system. It's just that it was a non-denominational Protestant system. So any Baptist, Episcopalian, or a Congregationalist would feel comfortable sending their child there, knowing that they were going to be reading the Bible, that they were going to be praying in school, that they were going to be having that very important fundamental part of education met and represented in that school. It's just that it wasn't obviously going to work out for Catholics and, of course, non-Christians, which is why Catholics started to form their own school system. In the early 20th century, though, when you began with the secularization of the public schools, they left out what I think is actually a very important, really a key component of education. They said that's for nights and weekends. But for those of us who see faith as something that is central to their lives and should be, they want their children in an immersive religious environment, you can't get that in a public school. So that's why in the private school system, most of them are religious. Now, if we had a system of true school choice in today's day and age, would we see a majority of public schools be religious schools? A majority of schools, if everyone had a choice of any school that they wanted, would a majority be religious? Frankly, I don't know. And quite possibly the answer is not. But so long as you have this dichotomy where the public school system must be secular, then of course religious schools are going to dominate the private sector.
Kathy, let's turn to you. A strong Catholic identity in schools is a key feature of successful Catholic schools across the country. How is this best achieved? And is that identity found in subjects other than religion?
Yes, Jason. I'm sorry, Emmett. Yes, Emmett. They are definitely found in subjects. We have a whole acronym called STREAM for science, technology, religion, and arts and math. I think it's really important that we know that this comes about by forming not only the students, but their families, and we work at that. It is a true partnership between families and the school, and the teachers and the parents. And that partnership allows us to strengthen faith of both the families and of the students. And it is through the strengthening of teaching of the faith and how we form the students and their teachers that we're able to maintain a strong Catholic identity. We think that the Catholic identity is the special sauce, the secret sauce of Catholic education. It's why our children do well academically and why they go on to be servants in the world after they graduate from a Catholic school.
Thank you. Kara, let's following up on your presentation. In your research, you've observed that sometimes Catholic schools have public school envy. Could you talk about the kinds of public school curricular fads that Catholic and other religiously affiliated schools should avoid?
Sure. So when we were doing most of the research for this book years back, the Common Core was still rather new. And that was before most states sort of started calling it something else or just not doing it altogether. And the Common Core being, in some way, shape, or form, something that almost every state adopted for a time. And there was discussion at that time, especially in some Catholic schools that were under-enrolled, about, well, maybe we need to, maybe parents need to know that these are the standards, that we're holding our students to high standards, which is part of traditional Catholic education anyway. One of the hallmarks of Catholic schools, if you really spend time in them, is that they usually have their own set of high standards and rigorous standards, and students are held to account for them. It's part of sort of the Catholic model, I would say. But many of these schools were thinking, well, could it be that if we adopted something like the Common Core, or we tried to sort of copy the Common Core in a way that would boost enrollment? And I would say that's one of the things that's a huge mistake. So all schools, Catholic, traditional, public, should be looking, for example, at their curriculum, should be looking at content standards, et cetera. But for Catholic schools that have traditionally, had a very content-rich curriculum, I would say, to look to public schools and borrow some of these, what we might call curricular fads, I think is a huge mistake. Instead, I think what the community needs to do, as it did here in Boston, is really look within and ask some of those questions, not only about curriculum, but about, for example, at Catholic schools can't pay their teachers nearly what. I'll give you an example. I mean, here in the city of Boston, I think somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm quite sure that the average teacher salary is upwards of $90,000, right? Boston's a very expensive place to live, but we also pay our teachers well, and that's phenomenal. But you know what Catholic schools can't do? They can't pay their teachers $90,000 probably anywhere, right? And so to think about those kinds of things internally as a community, if we're trying to get away from looking at like emulating public schools, is to think about, well, if we can't pay our teachers this much money, what is it that we have to offer? And many teachers stay in Catholic schools and in private schools generally, not for the money, but because they're getting something else. They're fulfilled. They want to be there because of the school's culture. There are many other reasons. So I think that passing these, what I would call public school fads, and as I said earlier, and as Kathy just pointed out, really concentrating on what is that distinctive brand of education, not only that I can offer as a Catholic school, but as this specific Catholic school, is really the way to go. Parents can use their local public school if they want to. That's not what they're seeking when they come to a Catholic school.
Kendra, your state, Montana, recently expanded the education tax credit program, the one that you fought to preserve in your Supreme Court case. Could you share with our viewers your experience and lessons learned in dealing with the Montana legislature and the governor?
I think that the biggest thing the biggest takeaway that I would have from this is that we as parents can't give up. We can't stop fighting for what we know to be the best fit for our child. And so when it comes to getting involved, I think that parents really need to work on being involved more at a local level and a district level here initially, and then just really speaking up and being that squeaky wheel that gets the grease. We've continued to push forward with this, with the case, even after the ruling was handed down. And we watched our state now implement this much more robust school choice program, but it's really because we've had so much input and push from parents and from other interested parties in keeping this going and not letting it falter and fall by the wayside, because really we're looking at future generations here and they're what that means for not just for our state, but for our nation as a whole, and what kind of quality education are we giving to our children now that will affect us for generations to come. So I think really the biggest thing for me, biggest takeaway that I can say is that we as parents really need to hold on to our beliefs and our foundations and be willing to stand up and keep fighting for what we know to be important for our children.
When you went in and talked to legislators, I think that's something that a lot of people haven't done. What was that like? Was it kind of a personal discussion like you're having with the guy next door? Were they responsive? Did they listen to you? Was it a daunting thing? Was it intimidating?
It certainly was very intimidating for me, and I've learned a lot through this process of being courageous and standing up and speaking up. But I think it really just depends on who it is that I'm speaking to, and some of those legislators certainly have our children's best interest at heart, and some of them will say that they do, but they maybe have other interests, or they're maybe fueled by other people that have more input in their back pocket. But just knowing that we couldn't give up that fight, that we had to keep standing up for what was right. We had a lot of help, though, when we worked with other organizations. And of course, our attorneys were a very big part of all of this, but we couldn't have done it without the extra assistance. And I wouldn't have known who to go and talk to and the people to speak with had it not been for the organizations that we worked with and our attorneys who were just so instrumental in getting this all put together for us.
Is it hard to get an appointment or a phone call with legislators?
I think it just, again, it depends on who it is you're communicating with, and the right ones there. We had a couple that were very, very supportive of school choice, and even our governor is very, very supportive of school choice. So it was very easy for us in our situation, but I'm certain that across this nation, there's other states where it would be a wall. It'd be like hitting a wall and trying to figure out who to talk to. But I would just say, don't give up. Just keep finding those people that are willing to speak and willing to listen and fight with you alongside, because really as parents, we don't have a whole lot of the clout and we don't have a lot of we don't know who to talk to all the time. These legislators do. So
Jason, EdChoice has produced numerous polls on parents' interest and satisfaction with private and religious schools. Could you talk about those polls and their implication for the Catholic school world?
Absolutely. First, as I mentioned in my presentation, we're seeing record levels of public support for educational choice. So it's really important to capitalize on that now, and as we have been across the country. But obviously, there's still a lot more work left to do, and we should be highlighting that to policymakers. This is something that parents support. It's something that they want. EdChoice also has a monthly tracking poll, which I highly recommend. You can go to the EdChoice website, you'll find it. It's edchoice.morningconsultintelligence.com. We can put that in the show notes. And one of the things we find is, when you ask families what it is they're looking for when it comes to education, one of the most important things, about 40% say that values, moral character, and religious virtues are extremely important to them. And again, that's just something that they can't get in the public system. And in terms of parental satisfaction surveys, we conduct these and other organizations conduct them. They're compiled on our website. We have a report called the EdChoice 1-2-3s. And you can see, 80, 90, 95% levels of parental satisfaction around the country for parents who are participating in school choice programs. This is something, it's not for everybody necessarily, but it is something that very clearly a large segment of the population wants. And it's important that our policymakers hear from you and hear from the parents that are going to your school and those who want to go to your school.
Jason, so when I was growing up, you Catholics, you just kind of went to your parish school. And I was very fortunate. I went to an excellent school up by the Benedictine nuns. But I'm wondering now, is there more competition now? Are parents going and asking about the content of what's being taught to their children? I don't think that was really done in my day. You just, like I said, you just went to your parish school. Is it more competitive now? Do Catholic schools and other religious schools have to make a positive presentation of what's being taught? Are fads going to be taught, or is it going to be more of an academic education?
I think there is a lot more competition these days, especially when you look at the polling. Support for school choice is much higher the younger the cohort gets, because think of people that were born in the radio generation, and now you're born in the iPod, or we're even past the iPod generation. That shows how old I am. So the younger you are, the more used you are to just customizing everything, except this one thing where you're assigned to a school based on the location of your home. Also, and I'll give some one critique I have for Catholics is this. It used to be, once upon a time, it was every Catholic child a Catholic school, right? That was something that was very, very important. It's gotten to the point where in a lot of cities, and I love the work that the Catholics do. It's the Catholic school mission to serve everybody, Catholic meaning universal. It's very important. But it is the fact that in a lot of schools, the majority of children attending that school are actually not Catholic. And it's not, in many cases, it's not because there are a lack of Catholics nearby. It's that a lot of Catholics are just now, instead of defaulting to the parish school, they're actually defaulting to the local public school. And I think that's something that priests should really be, shaking the pews and telling the parents how important it is, especially in these days, when there are so many influences on their children, that they are spending the majority of their day in an immersive Catholic environment. Secondly, those families that are choosing Catholic schools that are not Catholic, I can speak from experience, they're choosing it because of the academic quality compared to the public school. But if a bunch of charter schools open up and they're free and they're high quality, but they don't have that religious component, but they still do, provide discipline and some sort of character training, a lot of families are going to go choose those, especially in the absence of a school choice program. So I do think Catholic schools need to lean in on their distinctiveness. They do need to also make the case first to Catholics. Do your mission, go out there, take every comer. But there should be a much stronger emphasis among Catholics about sending your kids to a Catholic school. That's just my 2 cents.
Kathy, can you tell us what you think Catholic schools will look like in the coming decade? And given enrollment trends, what are the long-term challenges to the church leadership in this regard?
I think that our schools will embrace their Catholicity. I think that we have heard that message and people believe in that message and that we want to do that. So I think that the number of schools not doing that will decline until they close. I also think that our schools, that enrollment is going to stabilize. I think that we're at the point where we will stabilize. I think some schools are going to be small by design and by choice, and that will make all the difference. It won't just because they lost kids that they're small. It will be because they have thoughtfully planned to be small by design so that they can better serve the students. I also think that moving forward that we'll find Catholic schools return. Catholic schools did have a rich history of preparing students not just for college, but also the workplace. We've backed off that. I think that there will be some return to that. We teach our children to find truth, to seek truth and goodness and beauty, and we need to do that. But we also know that some children learn with hands-on kinds of things. And so things like medical arts, entrepreneurship, I think those things will be celebrated in a Catholic way. And I think that will be good for our church and our country and for the students we serve. As far as the churches, I think the church it is shrinking. The church is shrinking in the United States, across the world. Fewer people call themselves Catholics than 50 years ago. So I think we need to address that and see how that impacts Catholic schools. And as Jason said, to have Catholics attend Catholic schools, how does this work if the church is shrinking? And all data suggests that it is. So I think our church leaders need to look at that and study that and figure out what's our next step. How do we step up our evangelization efforts and remind people that Jesus is the hope for us? So I think that we need to do all of those things, but I think church leaders are going to have to figure that part out as they look at the world. It is a very secular world, and so the church has much work to do, but we're here and we're willing laborers for the field.
Do you think, is there a way to guard against the adoption of public school fads? I shouldn't say public school fads, education fads that come in and capture a school and end up making education more difficult, less rational?
I think that the only reason we don't jump in on all fads is we don't have the money to do it. The fads always cost money, and those things have to be vetted carefully because of that reason. I mean, you can't protect against all of it, but it is very much a necessary part that we look at what we're doing and make sure that we're doing what's right for students and that we're doing the right things so that our children are learning that they are able to grow in their faith and in their academic growth is very important to us. But almost every Catholic school says we educate the whole child. And if we stay focused on that, then we're going to be okay. Because that whole child is a spiritual child, it's a religious child, it's also a child that needs to run and jump and play, and just remember the basics of what children need. And if we do that, we're going to be okay. But yeah, there's been some things that probably didn't warrant our attention that got it.
Try to fit one last question in and this is for Kara. Kara, in your research papers and work, you've examined lots of different kinds of schools and promising models, including the Cristo Rey schools discussed in the book. What can we learn from work study models like Cristo Rey in the thinking about the future of Catholic schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line, what we can learn is that you can still be a Catholic school and teach the Catholic faith and teach in the Catholic tradition, but sort of innovate in terms of how you get kids in the door, what their relationship is between school and, for example, something like work. So Kathy also mentioned medical arts. That's another thing that we see here. Schools that are focused on, getting kids into medical careers, giving them hands-on experience. And I think that, something we learned from the Cristo Rey model is, well, how do you operate a school when kids can't afford to pay tuition, but the very children you want to serve and families you want to serve are those who by definition won't be able to afford to pay tuition? Well, you do it by engaging with the community in a really meaningful way and saying, what the Cristo Rey model does is it says, I'm going to pair students with work study experiences, and the money that they earn in part from that work study experience will go to pay their tuition. And so it accomplishes much more than getting kids through the door. It educates them to a high standard. It gives them work training and opportunities, life experience, I think. Most importantly, how do you land and walk in this world as an adult in work, while at the same time giving them a Catholic education that's going to help with that? How do you land as an adult in this world even more?
Kara, thank you very much. And thank you to all of the panelists. It's really just a fantastic panel. And I'd like to especially thank the Pioneer Institute and the National Catholic Educational Association. And I don't know, Jonathan, do you have any words to add?
Thanks so much, Emmett. And thanks so much everyone joining us in our group of panelists. We appreciate your time today. We hope you found this helpful. Feel free to share the webinar with your friends and colleagues. And you'll find a link to the on-demand webinar in our follow-up. And please check out the resources in the chat box, as well as in our follow-up with you. If you're interested in a certificate of attendance for the webinar, we invite you to fill out the post-webinar survey, and we appreciate your feedback. So with that, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a blessed rest of your day.
Thank you all, and thank you, John, for running the webinar for us.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Lovely to see you all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
God bless.